Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about prostitution in ancient Egypt. There are several reasons why I wanted to cover this topic. One is because I have been asked about it many times. But another is that it makes us confront how our modern categories fail to do justice to the past. We want to sort people and their behaviors into neat little boxes. And that doesn't always work with history. So today we'll look at what the evidence actually tells us about how sexuality worked in ancient Egyptian society. But before we get started, please remember to subscribe if you haven't yet so you never miss an episode. 1. It defies modern labels. The term prostitution is a modern label and oversimplifies a reality that was far more fluid and complex than our definition allows. For example, ancient Egyptians didn't have a word that exactly translates to prostitution, and they didn't necessarily view these roles in the same way we do. They didn't see them as a binary of this is respectable and this is sinful. Instead, the lines between the sacred, the sensual, and the commercial were much blurrier. Today, we typically think of prostitution as something that happens outside the temple walls, something separate from the religious sphere. But in ancient Egypt, the two were much more intertwined. 2. The sacred and the symbolic. The priestess, the goddess Hathor, was central to this concept. She was the goddess of love, music, dance, joy, and fertility. And her priestesses, the Kenna, were expected to embody her many aspects, including her sexuality. The Kennet performed ecstatic, sensual rituals in her honor, and their connection to the goddess made them key participants in maintaining cosmic order, or mut. Their job was to invoke the goddess's power to ensure fertility, both in terms of agriculture and human reproduction. Now, it should be noted that while some scholars have interpreted this as an example of sacred prostitution, there is no direct Egyptian evidence for that term. The Egyptian records simply describe priestesses performing rituals. So the idea of sacred prostitution comes from later Greek historians. However, it does appear that those rituals included a lot of symbolism related to sex and fertility. So it's not surprising why later writers made that connection. For example, Hathor's image frequently appears on the walls of tombs, where she is shown in various stages of undress, sometimes dancing or playing musical instruments. In one tomb, the goddess is shown wearing only a headdress and a necklace, while holding a sistrum in each hand. The inscription above her reads, "She who makes the heart rejoice with her singing. She who cheers the heart with her beauty." So the connection between sexuality and religion is clear. But it wasn't just the priestesses who played this role. There were also elite courtesans, women who worked outside the temple but whose job it was to embody the goddess in a more refined setting. 3. The elite courtesan, the entertainer. In addition to the temple prostitutes, there was a class of skilled, educated courtesans and entertainers who worked at banquets and private gatherings. They were hired specifically for their ability to make an event more lively and enjoyable. They performed as musicians and dancers, but they were also valued for their wit and charm. These women weren't just there to titillate the guests. They were expected to be well-versed in a variety of topics and able to hold their own in a conversation with the most intellectual of the party. Their presence was a sign of wealth and sophistication. Having the most beautiful women around added an element of prestige and luxury to any gathering, and having the means to hire them was a sign of high social status. The best courtesans could achieve great wealth and influence. They were frequently given as gifts to show favor or to seal an alliance, and they could use their position to advance their own interests and gain access to powerful circles. In fact, many of them became symbols of prestige and power. appearing on the walls of tombs as symbols of the deceased's wealth and status. 4. The common sex worker, the transaction. Outside the temple and the banquet hall, common prostitution occurred in taverns, breweries, and harbors. This was straightforward commercial sex. The women typically received payment in the form of bartered goods, such as grain, oil, or beer, rather than money. This type of work was considered low status, and these women lived on the margins of society. They were often judged and harassed by the police, and their children were denied rights and privileges. 5. Surprising legal protections. Despite their low social status, sex workers had recognized legal rights. Egyptian courts heard cases involving disputes over payment between a worker and a client. For example, one case involved a man who refused to pay a prostitute after finding her unattractive. The court ruled in the woman's favor, stating that since a service was agreed upon and rendered, the worker was entitled to payment regardless of the client's satisfaction. In another case, a woman sued her pimp for refusing to pay her for her services. The court ruled that pimps were legally obligated to compensate their workers fairly for their services. Overall, the Egyptian legal system seemed to focus on upholding the transactional contract rather than making moral judgments. 6. Fluidity of roles. The concept of prostitution was embedded in a larger cultural context, in which a woman's identity was not fixed. A woman could be a wife and a mother, but she could also be a musician who performed sensual dances at a festival without losing her social honor. It all depended on the context. Egyptian society evaluated behavior based on its adherence to mat, a concept that encompassed balance, order, and justice. What mattered was whether or not a person acted within the bounds of their social role and maintained their personal honor. So while there may have been some societal disapproval, it seems that engaging in prostitution wasn't necessarily seen as a moral failing. 7. A window into society. The practice of prostitution in ancient Egypt reveals a lot about the society that allowed it to thrive. It shows an advanced and pragmatic economy that could accommodate freelance labor and a surprisingly modern legal system that sought to regulate even the most marginalized trades. It also shows a culture that didn't view sexuality as taboo, but instead integrated it into religion, economy, and daily life. It was a society that understood the complexities of human nature and allowed for the fluidity of identity and behavior that our modern world still struggles to comprehend. Ultimately, understanding the practice of prostitution in ancient Egypt challenges our modern perceptions and encourages us to see the past on its own terms. It reminds us that our categories don't always apply, and that other cultures may have had different values and norms than our own. It also shows us that the world was much more complex than we might imagine. And with that, we come to the end of our episode on prostitution in ancient Egypt. I hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Please let me know your thoughts down below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. Until next time, stay curious.